Not every project that you'll end up with will need a full rebuild from top to bottom, but instead, it might just need to be freshened up. And that's because there's no point in looking for problems where there aren't any. And this machine is a fine example of that very situation, but at this point we don't know it just yet, and we'll have to go through all our diagnostic work just to find out. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this rather plain string trimmer from the Weedeater brand. And the problem is that we're not sure what's wrong with it, but a starting problem would be very likely. If you didn't know it, two-stroke machines like this one don't appreciate being left unused for a long time, and unfortunately, that's what happened to this one. I'm not sure why, but the airbox was installed upside down, which makes reading the starting instructions really difficult to do. There's also something rather unique about this machine, and that's the choke and purge bulb setup. When you push down on the bulb, it automatically activates the choke, which sounds great, but wasn't ever used again, so it's not as good as you think. And to deactivate the choke, you just need to squeeze the trigger. I mean, it's a good idea, but too bad it didn't make it very far. Next, we'll take a look at the sticker with the model and serial number on it, just in case we need this information to order new parts. Now, to quickly tell if the engine is damaged beyond repair, we'll just slowly pull on the starter rope and feel how much the engine is fighting back. And I'm happy to report that this engine is fighting back very well, so it's very healthy and it's worth fixing. Where there's really nothing left to do now other than to see if the engine will start and run, and if it does, we'll have to change our plans. I also did look in the fuel tank just to make sure there was a fuel filter in it, which there was. The next test is whether or not the purge bulb will be able to pull fuel from the tank through the carb, and luckily it looks like we're good to go with the test start. Not sure why the fuel was darker than it should be, but I'm guessing that was the fuel that was sitting inside the carb from the last time. But after a couple more presses on the bulb, it now looks good, and we'll attempt our first start. Well, surprisingly, it started and it ran great too. I wasn't expecting that to happen, so what now? Yes, I could just give it back to them as is, but I wouldn't be much of a friend if I did that. Well, the new plan is to freshen it up a bit and making sure it's going to last for another long stint, and hopefully we won't find any more surprises. Now, the cleaning you're seeing is for me. I really don't enjoy working on a dirty machine if I can help it. But it is understandable if you are short on time not to clean it, but I've got a little bit more time to burn. Just be sure not to get any water inside the air filter area or the muffler, but that's easier said than done. Now, this fuel line looks pretty good. I guess we could keep it, but since we're probably going to replace the other fuel lines, we'll change this one too. Of course, our first step would be to pour out all that fuel we just put into the tank. That way, we can keep from making too much of a mess and lessen the chance of a fire. Then we can take a good look at the fuel lines, and that's when we notice something really odd. The larger fuel line is still in good shape, but the smaller one has hardened up and is no longer sealing well in the opening, which means there's a fuel leak here. So in this case, the smaller fuel line is the fuel filter line, but you're welcome to make the larger line the filter line if you want to. Just as a tip, since we're going to replace the fuel lines, just cut them to make it easier to take them out. But if you really wanted to try and reuse some of those old fuel lines, well, that is your choice, but that choice might come back to haunt you later on. The larger fuel line I'm using is 3/16 of an inch outside diameter, but you're welcome to make your own choice. Now, since we know this carb works as it should be, I don't plan on taking it apart, so we're just going to replace the top fuel line first, but you can do it later on if you want to. Next, we'll move on to replacing the fuel lines, but because this area is so tight, filming would be difficult, so to make it easier to film, we'll take the air filter box off. But since the bolts that hold the airbox to the engine also secure the carb as well, it'll have to come off too. Now, if you are feeling a bit adventurous, you could open the carb and take a look around, but I doubt you'd find anything worth looking at. The fuel line routing on this machine isn't too crazy, but you have to be careful because someone else might have messed it up before you ever got your hands on it. But don't worry, we'll talk about where all the fuel lines go when we put the carb back onto the engine. Also, the end for the throttle cable attaches to the underside of the plate, and that's because the plate has a raised part that has to be cleared. So the first line I'll be installing will be the smaller fuel line for the fuel filter, and this is my choice to do it, but like I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to change it. Also, to help get it into the opening in the fuel tank, cut the end at an angle. I'll then reach into the fuel tank using my long pliers and work several inches of fuel line into it. We'll then pull out the end through the fuel cap opening and cut off the angle piece and then install the fuel filter. Now depending on what kind of fuel filter you have, this might be difficult to do, so be patient. Luckily, this fuel filter is a good match for the fuel line we're using, so it wasn't bad at all. And after a bit of twisting, we were able to get it to fit. Then we'll place the filter back into the fuel tank. Just make sure the filter is in a good location in the fuel tank so it can pick up all the fuel it can. For the fuel return line, we'll use the same method as before, but we only need to pull in about an inch of fuel line instead of several inches. There was a plastic splice on the return line which was there to keep the line from backing out, but more fuel line will do the same thing. Of course, you're welcome to make the return line as long as you want, and there's no harm if you choose to do so. And after locating the carb to the engine, we're able to figure out where to roughly cut the fuel line. Now you don't need to be exact, otherwise if you cut it too short, you'll have to run a new fuel line, so I'd give it a bit extra to cut off later on. So when connecting the fuel lines to the carb, the smaller fuel filter line will connect to the brass port further away from the purge bulb, while the return line will connect to the lower port on the bulb. And don't worry, we're going to do a flow test of the fuel system, which will help to confirm that the fuel lines are connected the way they should be. You don't need to mount the carb for this test, but I'm going to do it to make it easier to see the flow of fuel. You can just hold the carb in your hand instead. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line, enter the carb, then flow through the short fuel line into the bulb, and then leave the bulb and go back to the fuel tank. I know it was tough to tell, and that's because there was already fuel in the carb, which meant there was no way to watch the fuel flow through the lines. However, if you just kept an eye on the return line, you would see that fuel was returning back to the fuel tank, which is exactly what's supposed to happen. Now that we know the fuel lines are correct, we can finish installing the carb and filter base to the engine. Now the air filter is nothing more than a piece of foam, but luckily this one is still in great condition, so we're going to reuse it. If however yours is in really bad shape, you might have to replace it, but luckily the parts for this machine are still available and pretty cheap. So would it be possible to upgrade this carb to a more conventional one with a regular purge bulb? Probably, but I've never tried it. There is one more thing we need to do, and that is reload the string on the spool, otherwise this engine won't have a load on it when running. That's the reason why I didn't run the engine at full speed when we first got it started and running. There was no string on the trimmer head. So unfortunately, I don't have any smaller diameter trimmer lines, so we'll have to use this larger one, which is not ideal, but we'll see what happens. Just make sure that the line isn't too long because it'll put too much load on the engine. However, the cutter on the trimmer head should take care of the excess on this one. And despite the larger trimmer line, it seems to run just fine at idle and at full speed. Now don't be confused by the trimmer line, this is not meant for heavy duty use, no matter what kind of line you use. This is a light duty machine, meant to be used around the house, on your curb, driveway, and fence. It's not meant to be used to take down tall and stout weeds, otherwise you're going to realize why this machine is built the way that it is. And if you do need to do some major clearing, I would consider a better machine. So my question is, what is your opinion about this kind of string trimmer? I know this is not a powerful machine, but is it enough for you to use? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.